Uh, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We start with the first session. You have the biodata on the three speakers, but I will briefly mention some of the highlights. On my right is Mr. Dan Blumenthal, Director of Asian Studies, American Enterprise Institute of Washington. Now, he has served in and advised the US government on China issues for over a decade. From 2001 to 2004, he served as the Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Department of Defense. He is the co-author of a book called An Awkward Embrace, The United States and China in the 21st Century, which was published in 2012. On my left is Professor Shi Yin Hong, who is Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center on American Studies at Renmin University in China. He is a counselor on the State Council of the People's Republic of China, and he has served as a counselor on the State Council since February 2011. I first met him at a conference in Nanjing last year, and I was impressed by the forthright and authoritative way in which he presented China's thinking on various issues. He has been much sought after for media interviews. On my far left is Professor Satoshi Morimoto from Japan. He is a national security and defense policy specialist and a professor at Takushoku University. He is also a former Minister of Defense in the Noda cabinet, and before that held several positions in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. I will ask Dan to start the ball rolling.
Well, I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers of this conference. It's quite impressive and very much a privilege to be here. And for everyone here, an impressive crowd who's come out to hear what we have to say. And of course, a very good and thoughtful and insightful, thought-provoking keynote speech to start things off. So I was asked to speak on how the US-China Japan rivalry impacts on Southeast Asia, and particularly, obviously, from the perspective of the United States and US interests in the Asia Pacific. So I'd like to begin with a question I think that has to be asked over and over again for US policymakers and strategists, which is, what are we doing here in Asia? Why are we still here, and what are our purposes? I think it helps to go over some fundamental purposes and interests that the United States acquired and still has since the end of World War II. And I think importantly to note that one of the reasons that many US presidents, at least since the end of the Cold War, have pointed out the growing importance of the Asia Pacific as wealth and power shift here in terms of the center of gravity of world economics and politics, but it's been a very gradual process for the United States to shift more of its diplomatic and military and other investments and energies in the Asia Pacific. And that's because it's important to note that the Asia Pacific has really been relatively stable and peaceful over the course of the last few decades. And it's always important when you have a period of relative, and nothing's perfect in international affairs, peace and stability, it's important to ask the question of why is that? It's much easier to analyze why things are unstable in other regions or why there's war and conflict. And one of those reasons I would submit is because the United States has always defined its interests in the Asia-Pacific, at least since World War II, very broadly. So we have some specific core or vital interests, including the forward defense of our own homeland out into the Asia-Pacific, a legacy of World War II. We have interests and have long interests in maintaining a favorable balance of power on this side of the Eurasia landmass, and not or trying to prevent the control of one hegemonic power or one hostile power, whoever that might be in the course of history. And of course, increasingly the free commercial access and access and use of the maritime commons in the Asia Pacific. But the means to that end has been quite expansive. We have, of course, an alliance system and a partnership system that we want to defend and advance, as well as trying to create this global international system. Many call it the liberal international system that we want our friends and our partners to join. And on that note, I think the international system has been flexible enough to accommodate many emerging powers, including, not least of which, China, which, out of mutual decision between the United States and China in the early 1970s, China decided to join the international system and did so with great gusto. And we've seen, of course, the greatest and fastest order of wealth creation and pulling out of poverty, I think, probably in world history in terms of the compressed time frame. But it's also managed to accommodate the growth of the Asian tigers first, and is hoping to see the same thing in terms of Southeast Asian countries. The U.S. grand strategy for advancing its interests in the Asia Pacific has been based on a preponderance of U.S. military power in the region, very much supported and undergirded by alliance presence, particularly Japan, as a key geostrategic actor for United States policy. It's been through diplomatic alliances and leaderships and the attempts to help create or bring other countries into the general international system. And as I said so far, the reason that it's been relatively unquestioned in terms of U.S. leadership in the Asia Pacific, even during some very hard times, the Vietnam War and the end of the Cold War, is because it's worked. It hasn't been perfect, but it's worked in terms of the peace and prosperity of the region. So you have to ask what is changing and why do we care? And of course, the change is China's rise or resurgence to prominence and power, and some of the attendant uncertainties and questions with regard to that. So from the U.S. perception, and I think from the Chinese perception in terms of the security realm, things have gotten much more competitive in terms of China's use of coercive power alongside other peaceful means of power, as well as some questions as to whether China fully accepts some of the premises of the international order, not so much in terms of financial and economic global management, but more in the realm of how to resolve disputes, how to use international law and institutions, and those are open questions. And I should state that none of this should be of any surprise to anyone. China, like many emergent powers, including the United States before it, is more powerful and more ambitious and wants to change things more aligned with its own preferences. But just because it's not surprising, it doesn't mean that from the U.S. and allied perspective, it's stabilizing. In terms of so the United States has gradually, I think, since the end of the Cold War, been responding to the fact that the Asia Pacific is growing in prominence, but it's very gradual and fitful. So the United States has done things like help create APEC, and it always had a very expansive trans-Pacific view of the way the regional order should go. Trans-Pacific in terms of free trade policy, trans-Pacific in terms of political institutions and so forth. And that, too, has grown somewhat competitive, as was mentioned in the keynote speech, in the sense of China and maybe some other countries saying, well, let's talk about trans-Asia, not trans-Pacific. And that's always going to be a bit of a fault line. But the United States, of course, worked for China to enter the WTO, had worked hard to settle some nuclear issues with India and help it basically create an opening with India, upgraded its alliance with Japan, and done a number of other things, slowly moving more military force into the region. The central focus of U.S. policy is still Northeast Asia. That's slowly changing, and that's because of the very tight alliance with Japan and South Korea, the ongoing and perennial issues of the future of Taiwan and the future of the Korean Peninsula. But we in the United States cannot understate or emphasize how important the U.S.-Japan alliance is. It is the linchpin of our geostrategic position in Asia, in terms of its location, in terms of its way of thinking, and in terms of how we locate our forces in the Asia-Pacific. The difficulty for us, and what we really want to see, is Japan being a very consequential player and being able to enact its market reforms and its structural reforms so that we don't have kind of declining power that we're very dependent on for security reasons, and that's in our interest. So in terms of the U.S.-China rivalry, it's a very explosive issue, Japan, in Chinese affairs. But at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to side with its ally, based both on common interests as well as common values. Southeast Asia is becoming more important geographically. The South China Sea for the United States and for other countries is crucial to maritime commerce and maritime trade. For China, it's really the one way out into becoming a blue water navy. So there's competitive dynamics at work there. In looking at Southeast Asia, it's important to also note that China is rising, but it's not the only country in the region that's rising. These very big Southeast Asian countries that are in their own sense rising and have very independent and autonomous strategic cultures of their own because of the colonial backgrounds and so on. I think there's a common thread, in terms of concern about not having China becoming too dominant in the region, and that's leading to some more security cooperation. Although it's common to say that Southeast Asia doesn't want to choose between the United States and China, it was certainly Southeast Asian countries, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, that pulled on the U.S. sleeve to get more involved in the South China Sea issues, and not the other way around. It certainly wasn't the U.S. preference. So I think there is a shared concern, which is at one common denominator. And of course, in looking at trend lines into the future, Southeast Asia, particularly countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, which are so big, could become major economies and major players, changing the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific. I will say that in terms of institutions and order building, I don't think, it's in terms of U.S. attention to it and maybe other countries' attention to it, it's still very much in nascent stages. I mean, it's nothing like the kind of liberal order building that happened in Europe. And, one can certainly chide Europe for its situation today, but it's a victim of its own success. It created, the United States and Europe together created, what what we all wanted, which was a Europe whole and free. But we're not there with with Asia or ASEAN yet, and there's still some questions as to what all these different institutions mean and to what end. So I think we're in the very early stages of kind of regional order building in Southeast Asia. So let me just finish on some trend lines. One of the key trend lines we're all going to have to get our heads around, and I think this is very hard to do in Washington, is that the Chinese economy is, as you'll hear later, is in stagnation and probably will be for some time in the next 10 years. And so much of what the United States and the rest of the world had to respond to was a China that was in growth, and that had all kinds of consequences in terms of energy demand and the way the China's needed to conduct themselves around the world. But that era, I think, is coming, at least for now, to an end. And the U.S. is on the rise, a re-rise or a strategic revival. A lot of that has to do with the energy sector. But the U.S. is carrying the weight of the global economy. There is a question of political will in the United States, which is, will we translate this growing wealth gap with China into power resources? And will we still have the wherewithal and the will to play our role? But the wealth gap is growing, and I think that's a major change, at least over the next 10, 15 years. The other trend lines, I think, are within China itself. The aspirations of the Chinese people, both inside and along the periphery, for these universal ideals of more justice and less corruption and more freedom, I think are really coming to the fore in terms of the contradictions within Chinese society. The Chinese people themselves seeking out something different from just what the party has to offer. And that could be a major change in world politics if China struggles from within to find its future and its identity. But I think the major trend line that we're going to see in the next 10 years, and this is where we ought to be careful of intellectual fads, is U.S. strategic revival and China's relative decline in relative terms. And I just throw that out there because it's worth a lot more thought going into the future. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Okay, Professor Xu.
First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Institute for South Asian Studies in Singapore and invited me to attend this significant forum. And also, I would like to express my gratitude to every one of you and in discussion. And today, I will make a presentation titled China's Complicated Foreign Policy and Evolving Strategic Rivalry against the United States and its associates in the Asian Pacific region. And roughly, I divided my talk into 3 parts. The first part is what looks like today's China. The second part is self-contradictory message delivered in China's external relationship, especially with the United States and its associates in East Asia and the Pacific. The last part of my presentation is a general note on the future of Chinese foreign policy and the major change of strategy emerging just now. What looks like today China? And today China is a huge nation state with dramatically increased economic, financial, and military strengths, touch on the second most powerful status in the world in some key areas of national power, and on the more centralized domestic power structure of political leadership. And today China is a country, though still has huge, multiple, and complex challenges at home, but concerns much more its external affairs and cut upon outside world because of internal economic imperatives, more intensive desire for geopolitical strategic rights, national glory as a major power, and vigorously increased popular nationalisms, and so-called triumphalism, and much more militant and ambitious armed forces. And today China is the awakening line and use Xi Jinping's words delivered once in Europe under a top leader who has a much more centralized power in his hands, believes in resurgence of China's national greatness, being proud of his hardliner posture to the Chinese rivals, big and small, and keenly aware of domestic popular applause because of that, and has a remarkable preference for strategic and operational approach of, as it were, pushing toward the bottom line without breaking it, even at several fronts. And today China is a great power, and it is a rather dramatic process of substantial transformation of foreign policy, making many things different from the previous discourse and practice in a rather short time span, therefore rendering itself and others underprepared, somewhat confused, and increasing chances of miscalculation. Second part, self-contradictory messages delivered in China's external relationship, especially with the United States and its associates in East Asia and the Pacific. And there have been two opposite sets of messages by words and deeds delivered by China under Xi Jinping's leadership. The first set, the more impressive one to the other major powers, and probably the more fundamental one is, first, the Xi Jinping repeated use of the theme, the great resurgence of Chinese nation, referred to more officially as China's June. Second, a shift in the driving aim of People's Liberation Army from effort to just build up modernized forces to the simpler but more comprehensive and forceful aim of being capable of fighting and fighting victoriously. Third, extraordinarily frequent official reports of breakthroughs in China's military buildup, including advanced weaponry, military technology, and including capability of PLA's combat readiness. Fourth, the further hardening of China's posture toward territory and maritime disputes with some neighboring countries, especially Japan and the Philippines. Though since the time around Shinzo Abe launched most recently the formal process of reinterpreting the Constitution to make Japan have military rights of collective self-defense, China's posture toward Japan has quietly begun to emerge some indications of change toward moderation. Fifth, the Southern Declaration of establishing the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, a major strategic action taken in the context of the intense confrontation with Japan. In the longer term, this represents the first formal expansion of China's maritime strategic space since the founding of People's Republic in 1949, beyond China's immediate offshore waters. Of course, this has fully self-conscious implications for the strategic dominance of the United States in the Western Pacific. Sixth, the remarkable decline, especially in the months before President Xi's Boao speech in early April last year. In early the year before last year, in early April 2013, on Hainan Island, in the number of references to principle of peaceful development. And this principle used to guide Chinese foreign policy and was declared frequently by Chinese government in the previous years. And Deng Xiaoping taking a low profile, another traditional principle in contemporary Chinese foreign policy is generally no longer referred to at all as well. However, on the other hand, and one can also and must refer to another set of developments since the 18th Party Congress, especially since the early summer of 2013. These remarkably reflected the complexity and inner dilemmas of Chinese foreign policy under the new leadership headed by Xi Jinping. First, repeated confirmation of the peaceful development orientation in leaders' statements since April 2013. Second, the much emphasized objective of creating a China-US new type of great power relationship, repeated again and again as China's favored central concept for the future of China-US relations. In fact, this concept has received Xi Jinping's personal insistence and is reflected by his repeated efforts to gain President Obama's acceptance of this characterization of the future China-US relationship. Though the record of Obama's acceptance has been bleak up to now, especially since the declaration of China's East China Sea ADIZ. Fourth, the extraordinary powerful diplomatic work conference held in October 2013 and attended by all the members of the Standing Committee of the CCP Politburo. This conference emphasized forcefully the general line of the Golden policy must be the guiding star of China's behavior toward neighboring countries. However, the strong impression it made at the time has been somewhat diluted since intensifying confrontation with Japan after Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine until weeks and days near to the beginning of Beijing APEC summit held in November 2014, accompanying with almost suddenly emerged China-Japan Full Consensus declared on November 7, 2014. This is indeed a major and hopeful development aimed at mitigating the China-Japan confrontation and making Xi-Abe 25-minute summit 3 days later possible. Fifth, remarkable moderation of China's acts in general in the recent past over South China Sea disputes in the numerous months until the sudden outbreak of China-Vietnam confrontation about establishment of China's oil rig in the offshore waters of Paracel Islands, together with increased efforts to improve China's relation with ASEAN and its member states, including Vietnam, a primary rival of China in disputes. This is despite the rumor that China might soon declare the establishment of a South China Sea ADIZ. Last part, a general note on the future of China's foreign policy and the major change of strategy emerging just now. The prospects of China's foreign policy are still uncertain, conditioned by various domestic and international elements that will continue to be dynamic and often mutually contradictory. As all the above indicated, the current Chinese foreign policy could be regarded as self-contradictory, reflecting mutually conflicting factors, domestic and international, behind it. Among major illustrations of that, China's changed post of the Ukraine crisis is remarkable. Before Russian annexation of Crimea, China appealed again and again to principles of non-intervention, peaceful settlement of international disputes through diplomatic dialogue and negotiation, and respect to state sovereignty and tightly integrate during crisis, in despite of the strategic importance of relation with Russia as a major pattern of China, as well as the almost intimate personal relationship with President Putin developed by Xi himself. However, just because of that strategic importance, and also because of the severe strategic tension with the United States since the declaration of East China Sea ADIZ, China's public appeal to the above principle has been reduced remarkably in frequency and loudness in recent months and weeks in the context of Russia's continued efforts to separate Ukraine's eastern part from that country. And Beijing was beginning to give huge amount of financial assistance to Russia in the disguise of commercial payment to help it pass over the economic difficulties largely brought about by the impacts of US-EU sanctions. However, among uncertainties and self-contradictions, one major thing seems to be increasingly clear. And Xi Jinping's increasing clear aspiration for China's increasing power influence, or even preponderant rule in Asia and the Western Pacific, in long terms, at the cost of American dominant advantages. Toward that, Washington has been quite sensitive. Its remarkably increasing strategic suspicion and precaution on part of the United States toward China. Whether Xi Jinping's beloved projects of Euro-Asia Silk Road and Maritime Silk Road in the nature of strategic economy, or his stems on Asian affairs should be led by Asians themselves, issued at a conference on interaction and confidence building measures in Asia, so-called SICA, held in Shanghai in May last year, and whether China's advocacy and leading role in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, established in October of last year, with headquarters in Beijing, or China's suggestion of creating an enormous Asian Pacific Free Trade Zone, AFTA-AP, a tentative and ambiguous one issued shortly before the opening of Beijing APEC summit, and obviously somewhat competitive with the US-sponsored Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which has been already intensive negotiation process since 2011. All indications in the same direction, even together with substantial completion of AFTA negotiating with ROK and Australia. About this major aspiration for Chinese power influence at the cost of American one, self-contradiction has only been mainly in the hardliner aspects of Beijing's peripheral diplomacy, referred above, and again, referred once and again above, which has fueled a large part of China's Asian neighbors and been convenient for Washington's efforts to shape and consolidate some strategic united front to check China in the region. The vigorous and almost southern portion for China's strategic economy is strategically significant. Even more so if one takes into account our two major security agreements, most recently reached with Japan and the United States, respectively. The full consensus with Tokyo, and military agreement with Washington for preventing clash between each other's warships at sea and military aircraft in the air. Including China's power influence in Asia and Western Pacific at the cost of American preponderance in the region. This is an increasingly clear major objective of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping, whether it is in short, middle, or long terms. Most broadly speaking, there are two categories of major policy instruments to serve this objective: strategic military and strategic economy. Roughly speaking, until most recent weeks since China's 18th Party Congress, Xi Jinping used the primary strategic military in its broad sense, engaging quite intensively with strategic military rivalry and competition with the United States, in severe confrontation against Japan, in quite an assertive and hardline approach to the South China and East China Seas disputes, accompanied by intensive military and paramilitary activities. Assessing their double effects, one can easily find that they strengthen China's hard power, extending its strategic presence, but damaging China's international soft power, complicated further its peripheral diplomatic strategic situation, while increasing the remarkable risk of conflict with Japan and in less degree with the United States. Therefore, some strategic review has probably led to a major decision of strategic transformation in nature of decisively favoring strategic economy. It's very likely that from now on, China will, in a substantial period in the future, to focus on strategic economy in its foreign policy, based on its enormous economic and financial strength and broader diplomacy in the region and globally. The above-mentioned major developments with Beijing APEC as their parliament symbolic make me strongly inclined to believe this strategic transformation. In a sense, China's strategic rivalry against the United States with its associates in Asia and Western Pacific will probably become less hot, but more profound and widespread. It's just this prospect that will make the broad regional geopolitical competition more complicated for all concerned and more difficult to deal with for the United States, which is up to now one major strategic advantage. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, it's a very great honor to be joining this excellent forum, and also to have any excellent opportunity to make my remarks in this occasion. I believe most of you in this room can share the almost the same sense. That is the rapid growth that the Asian Pacific continue to enjoy has transformed the region into a global economic center. The universal values of liberty, democracy, and the rule of law, and the respect of basic human rights are also steadily taking hold. This region has great potential to contribute to the development of humankind in the 21st century. But however, as all of you know, we have a large and relatively disproportionate amount of fruits of that growth is being allocated to military expansion and arms trading. We also find ourselves facing a set of weapons of mass destruction and attempt to change the status quo through force or coercion. Clearly, there exist elements that spawn instability in the region. Under such circumstances, I would like to raise some point in this occasion. One is that, of course, a trilateral relationship between U.S., China, and Japan as a key factor for peace and stability in the region. However, it is concerning that China has been expanding its influence in domains with undefined state boundary, such as oceans, outer space, and cyberspace. In particular, Chinese naval forces protected by Chinese air cover passed through the first island chain along our country's southwest area and 9-dot line in South China Sea to the West Pacific Ocean to heal the power vacuum left after the United States withdrew from U.S. base in Philippines in 1991 or 1992. China has projected significant power over the Pacific Ocean, especially South China Sea. It is also concerned that China selectively interpret international law to make Chinese territorial assertions regarding oceans more favorable and to insist on an economic as well as security interest within the exclusive economic zone of China claimed territory. Freedom of navigation in the ocean should be secure for every nation. No member state in the region should be able to prevent other nations from maneuvering military assets or implementing training and exercise within their exclusive economic zone, seeking security interests as well as economic interests, and obstructing the activities of other countries. You remember that the 2001 EP3 incident and jet flying abnormally close to USP-8 last year, and also Japanese intelligence aircraft were incident in international provocation last year. I think you remember all of that. That is first point. The second point is that even so, we have trilateral relations among US, Japan, China should be stable and also contribute to the peace and stability not only in the Asian Pacific region as well as in a global sense. But I touch on the US, China, Japan trilateral relations. This is my personal impression. But China insists that the US-China relations is a new type of major power relations. However, both countries do not share the same values and approaches to the global common, such as the issue of cyberspace and outer space, the freedom of navigation, human rights, the freedom of expression, territorial issues, the treatment of minorities, and Hong Kong and Taiwan issue. In addition, both nations have different stance and approach on major foreign and security policy. As long as I understand, U.S. approach to China is still basically an engagement-oriented policy, despite most of Republican and Democrat of defense official, Pentagon official, preferring a hedging-oriented approach to China. This is my personal understanding. Japan-China relations face many difficulties, especially compromise over the political issues such as territorial issues, historical issues, such as the Yasukuni Shrine, as Professor, the researcher indicated. At the same time, both nations must promote reciprocal strategic relationship, especially in such an area as investment, trade, culture, environment, and technology, including a nuclear power plant. Japanese Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping, Chinese leader, met in November last year at the APEC meeting in China and agreed upon on the risk management in a maritime area, which is called Maritime Communication Mechanism. Still, the negotiation is going on. We couldn't reach the final agreement between both countries. Japan's approach to China is a hedging-oriented policy, strengthening deterrence and reaction capability based on the U.S.-Japan alliance and self-defense capability. It is our strong desire that it is our strong desire that the United States continue to play an important role for stability and mutual prosperity in a region. Japan will undertake all possible endeavor as allied state so that the United States can remain in the region and continue to have interest and benefit here. The first, it is necessary to have a strong relationship of cooperation among three countries, Japan, United States, and Australia, and to assist ASEAN countries in the improvement of capabilities and economic development based on such a relationship. Additionally, cooperative relationship among three countries, United States and Japan and India, will firmly strengthen, and aforementioned approach will be applied regarding issues facing Southwest Asian countries. In regard to the relationship between Japan and the United States, Japan roles will be increased through the division or modification of U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Guideline. Now, negotiations going on. I hope the conclusion will be sometime by the end of this coming April. And mutual complementary relationship between Japan and the United States will be reinforced. The TPP agreement, which is the economic partnership agreement, will be reached, and the new rulemaking will be implemented. Reform of domestic system in China, which will be obliged to join the TPP eventually, will be encouraged. TPP will play a role of political and economic alliance. It is also important for allied states to support rebalancing policy of the United States to continue to endeavor to construct a regional framework for this region. Asia is diverse and does not have a sufficient condition to allow the rapid creation of organization or framework such as NATO or EU in Europe. Major role for US and Japan is at least to progress with endeavor to craft a regional framework for dispute resolution. I think almost 3 minutes. Time is very limited, but I would like to raise the very important issue, that is the cooperation for enhancing the global commons. It is vital that we expect the rule of law, not the rule of by force, to maintain and develop open and stable seas. United Nations Convention of Law of Sea UNCLOS regulate the freedom of navigation on high seas and the peaceful solution of maritime dispute. At present, almost 165 nations and the EU have concluded this convention, and getting more countries to sign on will help make a rule of law more effective. The law we should all obey are apparent. Our Prime Minister Abe stated here last year there are 3 principles for resolving a dispute in accordance with the rule of law. One is that the state shall clarify the legal grounds for their own claims. That is the first one. The second, state shall not use force or coercion in trying to derive their claims. The third, the state shall seek to settle dispute peacefully based on the law. Our government asks that all countries involved observe these 3 principles. We also call on the international community to support countries that uphold these principles in order to more stable and prosperous region in the world. These principles should also meticulously apply to the South China Sea, where dispute over territorial right and problem arising from underestimated, eliminated exclusive economic zone and continental shelf boundary exist. Even now, we continue to witness confrontation and attempt to resolve dispute unilaterally through force. The international community has a great interest in these South China Sea issues. We believe these issues should be resolved peacefully through dialogue in accordance with the law. I think this forum can contribute to find out more effective, efficient solution in this issue, which almost all Asian countries can share the same concern. Thank you very much.
Now we will have 15 minutes of interaction between the speakers. I'll pose a few questions, and after that, we throw both the discussions to the floor. I think I'll start, if Professor Morimoto, if you don't mind, this time I'll start from your side. Two questions for you. I'll ask the first one first. Sometime last year, how do you expect the change in tack in China's policies that Professor Shi Yin-hong mentioned to affect Sino-Japanese relations? For example, what do you expect from the 4-point agreement reached between China and Japan a few months ago? How far will it go in reducing tensions? And in particular, do you think the stalled free trade area talks between China, Japan, and Korea will restart?
I think we strongly desire to hold China-Japan summit meeting when we joined the APEC meeting last November. And I think it was successfully to reach the 4-point of agreement between both countries. But especially the 4th point, which the both countries will take a gradually step to open the diplomatic dialogue, to exchange a view in terms of not only economy but also security and diplomatic relationship so far. Also, we both countries agree upon to seek for the final agreement on the maritime communication mechanism. Will be agreed upon. I think this is very encouraging for us because since China set up air defense identification zone in November 2013, the both countries fighter weapon close to each other in East China Sea. I think this is very dangerous so far. Of course, both sides very cautiously operate to hold the cap, combat air patrol, not to cross each other. So we have a very strong intention to provocate China. And well, anything happen, we cannot expect anything happen because a fighter, combat air fighter, is a very high speed. It is a quite different of environment on the sea. So I think the both head of state agree upon some sort of a confidence building measure mechanism or crisis management mechanism is very encouraging. we try to make best effort to reach the final agreement. So far, we have no answer from China to resume the dialogue on this issue. That is the current situation.
Professor Shi, do you want to follow up on this issue?
I think
Are you
that
optimistic?
the Professor Morimoto's understanding of consensus, Richard, and between Xi Jinping and Abe's administrations are quite right. The message is clear, although Xi Jinping had not been smiled toward Shinzo Abe when shaking his hands in Beijing. Message is clear that the confrontation, very intensive confrontation with Japan, which have, as all the world declared, that have a lot of, risk of major conflict, have to be mitigated. And both governments committed to mitigate the confrontation. And the second is resume the dialogue. And not only diplomatic dialogue, but also military and security dialogue. And for the purpose, first of all, to prevent military conflict. And of course, this is a small step. But if you look back to past 2 years, such a highly, extremely intensive confrontation between Tokyo and Beijing in maritime air and sometimes in air, I think that this is a big step. Of course, big step.
Can you make it brief?
Okay, yes. Whether big step could lead to further big steps, and still uncertain. But the intention is now, for the first time in the past 2 years, is there.
Okay. Professor Morimoto, there have been concerns about the Abe government's reinterpretation of the 1947 Constitution. Even in Japan, I understand, the public is not happy with the reinterpretation, with about 50% or more of people not happy with it. Now, Mr. Abe will be in power for 4 years more. How much further will he go in reinterpreting the Constitution to build up the Japanese military? Will the Japanese public support him?
I think, this is Prime Minister Abe's job. If I allow, I can make my very personal perspective on this issue. Yes, maybe Prime Minister is seeking for the chance to revise the Constitution in the future, if possible. Why if possible? Because first of all, we need 2/3 of our upper house, lower house to the referendum for the people on the draft version of Constitution. According to the poll, more than half of the people in my country are affirmative to the change of Constitution. Without any indicating a specific article of Constitution, the question is very strange, but most of the people say yes to modify the Constitution. However, if we ask whether you agree upon the Article 9 of Constitution, most of the people say no. So I personally do not think even Prime Minister Abe intends to modify the Constitution. I think that modification version of Constitution will not include Article 9. I personally don't think so, for the military.
But he need not modify. He can keep on reinterpreting, isn't it? Okay. Okay, since we are running out of time, I'll turn to Professor Shi. Professor Shi, sometime last year, you said in a media interview that up to about 2009, you believed that China's rise would be peaceful. But more recently, you were not so sure. Now, as we have just described, there is some change or some modification in China's policies. Do you still believe that it may not be possible for China to rise peacefully? If not, why?
I will repeat my, observation 1 or 2 years. I'm not so sure. Because if you look at the past 5 years or 4 years or even 2 years, there are several major changes. And first that this is continuity, but also change. China's economic strength, even military strength, continue to dramatically rise. And the second, the Chinese people's mentality is changing. And the Chinese population in the past are characterized, first of all, by so-called victim mentality. But now it has become primarily characterized by Trumpism. And also, I think that even shortly before 18th Party Congress, the Chinese central leadership already pursued a course, and ambiguous expert at that time, but more concrete actions followed since 18th Party Congress. That is, China have to be a great maritime power. And also, a little more than 2 years ago, we now have a new leader, just as mentioned in the presentation. He believed in resurgence of China's national greatness. He believed in China not only shall become more strong economically, but must become stronger, much more stronger militarily. He believed in Chinese strategic rising western part of Western Pacific. And he have a different strategic style up to now, much, much more determined and assertive than previous leaders Hu Jintao. And there are a few other, changes in China recently emerged in past 2 years, including elite attitude. And although China still talk about the so-called unique Chinese model and particularism of China's load, but now began some elites talk about some universal significance of a particular experience. So I think that, of course, on the other hand, China benefited so much from previous traditional peaceful development orientation. And within China, a large part of elites as well as public are committed to this traditional older ways. So I think that the future is not certain. But of course, and up to now, China's top leader, although become much more assertive and hardliner in foreign policy, but still formally again and again declare that China will continue to rise peacefully. So let's see in the future.
Okay, my second question to you is, now, the new approach to foreign policy or some modification which you have described is designed to reduce risks and the diplomatic costs of the previous approach. Now, in your summary sheet, because I couldn't entirely hear your presentation fully, my fault, you chose your words very carefully. You say there will be elements of moderation in the new approach. Will these elements of moderation extend to China's policies in the South China Sea? Will there be significant changes there?
Yeah, I think most of the development is China's primarily China declared there should be a two-track to deal with and South Chinese disputes. I think that what he means is primarily that for territorial disputes, China will not make concessions to neighboring countries. And neighboring countries in sovereign claims will not make concessions to China for a long, long time. But we shall not to make quarrels and even potential conflict happen, so frequently. So China is willing to, talk with neighboring countries and sometimes bilaterally, and if it touch on Code of Conduct South China Sea, and we is willing to talk bilateral with ASEAN countries to control the rivalry and to shelve and even temporarily some disputes, and to make and everyone still could have a peaceful relationship in this maritime region, although Taipei dispute is still there. And so I think especially what's remarkable is in the past few months, since last May, China and Vietnam and both sides make a lot of efforts, and compare with what happened in last May and China-Vietnamese relations. And since then, are much more mitigated, although dispute is still there.
But Southeast Asians feel that China is also very active in building airfields, and there's some speculation that there may be a ADIZ imposed on the South China Sea. That kind of activity will continue, I suppose, from you?
I think that I dare not and I don't want to cheat anyone. And sometimes you see China's moderation. Sometimes you see China's hardline approach. And they exist at the same time. And I think our Chinese approach toward the South China Sea dispute is complicated. And China wants this, and territory, and Chinese military, strengthening South China Sea. But I can assure you, China also wants and good feelings, and markets, and diplomatic relations, and with as many as South Asian countries. Of course, and this will, this kind of complicated approach is not so popular in Southeast Asia. But if China wants to be fully popular in South Asia, Chinese leaders think that they will become much less popular within China. So this is balancing game. And I don't think that Chinese leaders often play this game very well. But anyway, they see and they have two requirements to meet. One is our foreign neighbors. Another is Chinese domestic nationalist audience. This is a difficult task, but they still have a sense and to try to strike a balance.
Okay, thank you. I think I've run out of my 15 minutes. Good. So maybe I'll spare you a question. Okay, we'll throw the debate up to the floor. Please identify yourself and do not be too long, otherwise I'll have to cut you off. Yes, Michael Montesano from ISIS.
Algid has identified me, so I don't need to do so. I'm not going to spare Mr. Blumenthal questions. I have two questions for him. First, I'd like to know how inside the Beltway, former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser's statements about the recklessness of American foreign policy and its lack of dependability from Australia's point of view have been taken. My second question involves the pivot. To the shame of any thinking American, the pivot has been over-militarized, yet it's been more than a quarter century since the Pentagon has been a node of serious strategic thinking for the United States. How then can we believe that in the future the United States will be capable of serious strategic thinking about Asia? Thank you.
I have to admit I'm not familiar with, maybe you can familiarize me with Mr. Fraser's comments in terms of recklessness.
8 or 9 months ago, he wrote an essay that was circulated in Australia. But in the past month, that essay has found an outlet in the United States in which he argued that essentially Australia's decision-making power over whether to go to war had been outsourced to the United States in an era in which the United States had demonstrated excessively poor judgment in deciding when and how to go to war, and that Australia should be very concerned and alarmed about its continuing military dependence on the United States in the view of such recklessness. And coming from the Prime Minister that this is coming from, one can only hope that even those in Washington uncomfortable with the four-syllable words that this Prime Minister uses would take this statement to heart.
I think some of those issues are not new. There was certainly criticism in Australia and other places of U.S. policy or their own government's decisions to engage in combat in various places throughout the world. But again, a little historical background, I think, that goes back to the Vietnam War and other times. So, U.S.-Australian relations are extraordinarily tight, and there's going to be, disagreements. In terms of the larger question, Hugh White has gotten some more attention, I think, than Mr. Fraser, but in terms of the choice, the very stark choice, but it's kind of a false choice, for Australia. Well, in terms of how I see things for Australia, it's not true that, in my opinion, that the economic future is with China and the security future is with the United States. I think that lacks a little bit of a nuanced understanding of the global economy, and also is a little bit behind the curve in terms of, the era of great Australian commodities export boom is over to China, at least for now, and so I think most countries, again, to my points in my presentation, most countries are still, at least the security specialists, are lagging behind some of the economic realities, which is, we have perhaps a new challenge in our hands, and that's what does a world with relative stagnation in China look like, and relative growth in the United States look like? So, some of these choices are set up, in ways that are too stark. I think every country, including the United States, has significant interest in stability with China and with economic trade and investment with China, and every country, including the United States and Australia, have interests in a basic common view that it doesn't want the region to be dominated by China. So, if Australia, I guess, had other strategic options in that regard, they at this point would exercise them. But, and this is also to the point, and I'll get to your second question, but, to the point of, it's sort of, for Chinese friends, I often say, welcome to the club of being a great power, because it's just part of it. You're either criticized for doing too much or too little, and most of the time, right now, we're criticized for doing too little in terms of military affairs, slow responses to ISIS and all the rest of it. So, so that's just part of, being the United States. In terms of strategic thinking and the pivot, the pivot's a very unfortunate term. I mean, as I mentioned in my commentary, I mean, the long-term trend of the U.S. fitfully, relatively putting more focus on the Asia-Pacific has been, since the dawn of APEC and the dawn of the Clinton administration's decision to keep the same amount of troops in Japan and slow movements of forces. I mean, it's not, it's certainly taken on a interpretive, particularly from China, overly military hue, but in terms of, real military deployments or real changes, it hasn't been all that significant. I mean, the U.S. is security dynamics inside the first island chain and the South China Sea have become more competitive. The Chinese are quite open about that, and the U.S. is quite open about that, and both sides are trying to gain some kind of strategic advantage. I agree, finally to your point that, if it is indeed an Asia-Pacific century, then the U.S. Does have to put a lot more investments of all kinds and knowledge about the Asia-Pacific and the types of policies, strategies, and institutions. I mean, we're far behind. We're still very much, as a sort of strategic actor, Eurocentric and Middle East-centric.
I'm required to address some of the questions which have appeared on this device. So I'll interrupt the session with the floor. One question: do you think the recently announced agreement between China and the US to prevent military incidents in China's EEZ will work, thereby reducing the risk of accidental conflict in the Western Pacific? Professor Shi, what do you think?
I think most recently based on, almost emergent consultation between Chinese side and American side, and fixed on, and by both President Xi and Obama, and quite quick. I think that in the context of the dramatic increasing risk of crash between military airplanes of the countries in South China Sea area and maybe in less degree in East China Sea area, and also based on the last year's development that there's increasing risk of the clash between warships of both countries, and now the agreement. And this is very important. I think that, of course, and this, in some ways, this is still technical agreement, and because it's strategic rivalry between two great powers, the United States and China, in western part of Western Pacific, is still there, and could become more profound. But on the other hand, and both sides committed to make this kind of risk dramatically reduced. And I think that this quite effectively, together with other agreements on climate change, and even, the information technology, and quite substantially improve the atmosphere in the relationship between Washington and Beijing, and which in the past 1 year become too bad and will potentially negatively influence greatly the forthcoming presidential election in the United States, and even next American president's attitude toward China, whether Republican or Democrats. So both leaders and do a job quite well in time. Of course, if you look back at the fundamental opposition of Chinese position and American position on Southeast China Sea, on East China Sea, on cyber attack, on dramatic Chinese strategic, build up, nothing have been solved. But atmosphere improved. And the risk of conflict, at least for this, time, are dramatically reduced. So I think that this could make a relationship between Beijing and Washington in the next one, and have a minimally, okay, foundation. Although, look into the future and strategic rivalry between my country and Mr. Dan's country, especially in Western Pacific, could become more widespread and more profound. And we only hope that it shall not become so frequently, so prominent.
Yeah, 3 quick points. The first is on this kind of concern about international law, international norms, international customs. The behavior in exclusive economic zones is a long-term practice that goes back, 100 years at least, and worked. I mean, the Soviets and the United States during the time of strategic competition permitted each other to operate inside each other's EEZ, and it didn't lead to conflict and so on. And of course, for China to have a new interpretation of what's lawful in the EEZ will, I think, over time badly affect China, because other countries will have the same interpretations and try to keep the Chinese out of their own EEZs with lawful activities. The second, a lot of this is just not new. I mean, since 1997, we negotiated a maritime cooperation agreement with the Chinese, and after the EP3 incident in April of 2001, it just didn't work. It wasn't implemented by the Chinese side, at least from the American perspective, and that's because our systems are so different. They're so different. I mean, the party state versus the U.S. with a unified command and the president. There was nobody to call. So I don't have great. First of all, we have to look at this historically, and second of all, I don't have great confidence in these kinds of agreements. Although I think we should keep pushing and pushing and pushing because as was mentioned, we have a lot of military capability in these two regions. Finally, some things are not misunderstandings. They're simply we understand each other very well. We just have conflicting interests. And the Chinese have been trying to build a blue water navy, ocean-going navy for a long time, and need to get out, into the sea through the South China Sea. The United States looks at that from a freedom of navigation perspective, and so we're going to have to manage the basic conflict of interest rather than trying to keep saying we don't understand each other.
So, Professor Xi, will the Chinese military be happy implementing this? As Dan says, there's a contradiction here, because on the one hand, China wants to be, on the longer term, if possible, the dominant power in the Western Pacific. And both US and China are saying the Pacific is large enough for both. But what the US means is, we are here, will remain here in the Western Pacific, and you are welcome to increase your activities. But what China means is, when it says Pacific is big enough for both, is that you stay on the eastern side of the Pacific and not on the western side. I mean, in view of these contradictions, the Chinese military will strive to implement this.
I think President Obama and all of his main associates in Washington never say Pacific is so broad. Only Xi Jinping say it again and again, and the Pacific is so broad, can accommodate both of our countries. But Obama never gave any words heed. Until China declared East China Sea EDIZ, he immediately ordered to B-52 gone into. This means that, and I think that the Xi Jinping's statements about the broadness of Pacific and the possibility of accommodation for both China and United States in the Pacific is a geostrategic note for his concept of a new type of great power relationship between China and the United States. But just because of this, President Obama thinks that, and this means that China wants to have, access to strategic rights. And in the first stage of history, in the western part of Western Pacific, west of the first island chain, and the United States were never voluntarily gave to this. So we see in long process of history, this kind of the game, China gently push, and the United States maybe with some tactical wisdom, but never with strategic wisdom. And this is a great game in the western part of Western Pacific. I don't, I cannot predict exactly what about our future. But I believe, and within 10 years, or at most within 15 years, moment of truth will come. And at that point, the United States must make a decision to recognize China is a strategic great power in the western part of Western Pacific, or continue to resist China, which is much more strategically stronger even than today. Moment of truth is still not come, but will come. And I believe within 10 years, or at most within 15 years.
Okay. Any other question from the floor? No. Okay, looking at this, there are a few more questions. Could China and the US jointly work closely on anti-terrorism efforts worldwide?
The short answer is yes. But, it's, when one looks from an American perspective, or at least from this American's perspective, there are so many issues where the United States and China have common cause and should be working together. And certainly, we have tried in so many cases, in the case of North Korea and non-proliferation and so on. We've been discussing joint efforts on counterterrorism for many, many years, but not much has come of it. And part of that, I think, is China's working out its ways of just being a global power. What does it mean to be more exposed to terrorism and so on? The second point there is, the asymmetry in the sense that China is mostly facing terrorism from a region that it claims and controls, Xinjiang, and deals with it very much as a domestic issue, whether through its legal system or whether through its more coercive measures, whereas the United States takes a more global view of terror. I will say, that China is more exposed probably than it ever has been to Islamic terrorism, with the U.S. And NATO forces drawing down in Afghanistan, with China's energy activities in Central Asia, and China's increased energy activities with respect to Iraq and the Gulf. So I think this is something that China is thinking about in terms of how to protect overseas interests and how to deal with counterterrorism, but it's not something that the United States and China have been able to find common ground on.
If you want to have a response, very quick one,
Very
because I've
quick.
been asked.
I think it's no question, and that China committed to cooperate with the United States and other countries, and even more cooperation to struggle against ISIS. And China committed to cooperate with all other countries, including the United States, to maintain the you can say post-war Afghanistan stability and security. This is our interest, and I think that Dan already referred to it. Of course, approach and maybe somewhat different. Sometimes we think that, Washington's idea about to pacify this region and fight against terrorism is a little stupid. Our approach may be more wise, or U.S. think in the same way. So we talk, we consult with each other. We cooperate in many aspects, but there are still, disagreements. But disagreements in this front is not primary.
Okay, thank you. I have been asked to close this session because we are running into the time of the next session. So let's thank the speakers. Thank you very much. Start the next session.